a letter to a church in one of the most influential cities of the ancient world, from the most influential apostle ever known, a man who had never even met many of the believers to whom he wrote. This letter lays the foundation for their faith, for our faith, and explains how a people entrapped in sin and slavery can be reconciled to the perfect, just, and righteous God of the universe. This letter that became a biblical book that has shaped church history perhaps more than any other. This is Paul's letter to the Romans.
Look out, I need is 116. The rag on my king, Romans 116. We rag up at him daily cause he runs this thing. Can I do it? Yes, sir. Can I do it? Yes, sir.
I'm thinking about doing walk-up music every Sunday now, you know? I don't know, every other Sunday. So this song was by a Christian hip-hop artist, Trip Lee, circa 2012, and Michelle and I were living in Ohio at the time, and our three older girls were like 3 years old, 5 years old, and 7 years old, and I'm being legit, like this is basically all we play, like all the time was Christian hip hop. There was another song that was our favorite from Lecrae called Don't Waste Your Life, and every time I would turn it on and blast it in the house, Quinn, who was 3, would immediately, like Pavlov's dogs, like jump up and start running laps, like circles around the house. In fact, this week I played that song for Michelle without telling her. I blasted it and I just turned it on, and she was sitting in a chair and she's like, I felt like I was supposed to get up and start running around the house because those things just take you back, the memories, right? Well, the reason I played this song for you is because it does introduce our next section in the book of Romans, Romans 1, verses 16 and 17. So if you got a Bible, go ahead and turn there if you would, page 911 in the chair Bibles. But you notice the lyrics to this are, look, all I need is 116 to brag on my king, Romans 1:16. We brag about him daily because he runs this thing. Can I do it? Yes, sir. Can I do it? We rep the Lord truly. No, okay, I'm not. I'm a white suburban dude, like I shouldn't be doing that. But we might throw that in the mix next week, though. You guys good for that for congregational worship? You can learn that? Okay. All right. Notice what Paul says in Romans 1:16 and 17. He says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews, then to the Gentiles. For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." Here, Paul introduces us to his third reason for writing this letter. Remember, over the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at this. Why does the Apostle Paul write this letter to the church and the people that are in Rome? And we said it was because he was going to go visit them. In advance of his visit to them, a church that he's never been to before, a church that he didn't establish, he's writing to them for 3 purposes. The first purpose he writes to them is for relationships, right? He wants to make a relational connection with them. He hasn't been there, but he knows a number of people in the church, and he says, I want to come to you, and I want us to be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. The second reason he writes them is he wants to make Rome like an operational base. This is a powerful, resource, influential place in the Roman Empire. I mean, the most powerful, resourced, and influential place. And he says, my goal is to get to Spain, to go west, to go to places the gospel hasn't been preached. So I'm going to pass through on my way to you. I want to reap a harvest among you. I want more people to come to trust in Jesus, find life in him. I want to encourage you in your faith, and I want you to send me on to Spain to continue the message of Jesus around the world. And then this third purpose he's writing is he's giving us a foundational document for the church for all of the time. He is writing for truth. And so from Romans, we get the deepest, most significant theological letter that we have in all of the New Testament. Now, we spent a good amount of time on those first 2 purposes here in chapter 1. But here's the thing. Basically, from the middle of chapter 1, where we're at now, through chapter 15, Paul focuses on the third reason, the foundational document, the truth. He'll come back to the first 2 purposes in chapter 15 and 16, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to be focused on this third purpose for Paul writing. What he's going to do is he's going to try to explain in detail his claim in verse 16 and 17 that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. Now, we know that the gospel is the good news about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. But then there also is a lot surrounding that helps to further explain what that means. Like for instance, and these are the kinds of things that Paul is going to enumerate to us in Romans, like why do we need the gospel? Why do we need the righteousness of God? How did God actually provide that for us? How does an individual receive this gospel that God is bringing to us? And then what does that gospel accomplish? That's what the rest of Romans is going to be all about. And so we might say that the gospel is like a diamond. Many of you that are here, you are wearing diamonds right now. You can even look at your diamond if you want to, unless it's on your ears. Maybe somebody else can look at the diamonds that are there. But many of you have received a diamond from someone, or you bought one for yourself. And there's an interesting thing about diamonds. If you can look closely and intricately at a diamond, there are a lot of aspects to a diamond, right? You look at it from a distance, you're like, it's one thing, but you look at it up close and you spin it and the light reflects on it and it has all different cuts and aspects to it, and it shoots colors and rainbows out from the light reflecting off of it. There's a lot of aspects to a diamond. And when you turn a diamond and the light shines on it, you see different aspects of beauty in it. Or maybe think about math. For those of you that aren't so much into pretty things, math works too. There's basic math that you begin to do when you're in elementary school. So did anybody do flashcards? Do you remember flashcards? I don't know if they really push flashcards anymore. At the Carr household, we still believe in the old math. New math's fine too, but we believe in the old, whatever. Okay, so we do flashcards at home. So I thought maybe you should try this. Are you guys ready for some flashcards this morning? 2 times 3 is? Good job. Man, he's on it. 5 times 2 is? 36 times 47 is? No, I don't even know what that is. 12 times 12. There was a little pause. There was a little pause on the 12 times 12, but you got it. Okay, so you start off in elementary school, you do basic math, but you know something. If you're going to go further in math, there's a whole lot of other aspects to math, and with flashcards, you're just getting started. You start to plumb into the depths. You do pre-algebra, and then algebra, and then geometry, and trigonometry, and calculus, and all of these other aspects of math that push you into the depths. We can think of the gospel like turning a diamond with all of its aspects to see the beauty. We can think about the gospel like math with all different aspects to plumb the depths of that. And in the book of Romans, he's pushing us into the depths. He's turning the diamond to show us all of the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That beauty in Romans comes through exploring this primary theme, the righteousness of God. The gospel, he says, reveals the righteousness of God. And let's just walk through these 2 verses and explain further how Paul shows this to us. First, in verse 16, he says this, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel." Paul says, I am not embarrassed, and I don't shrink back from the gospel at all. In fact, if you look up in the verses before this, in verse 14, he says, I'm actually obligated to this gospel, to preach this gospel to everybody I can preach the gospel to, meaning I have a debt from God. Like God has called me into this. I hated Jesus. I was killing people that followed Jesus, and God was merciful to me, and he called me into his service. He revealed himself to me, and he called me to be the apostle to the Gentiles, so I am obligated. I do have a debt in this, and so I am compelled to everyone. And then verse 15, this is why I'm so eager. I'm excited about the gospel, and then I'm not ashamed. So I'm obligated, I am eager, and I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, we're going to come back to the unashamed part again at the end. But for now, why is Paul unashamed? And why is he so excited about the gospel of Jesus Christ? He tells us, he says, I'm excited and I'm not ashamed because this gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. I'm excited about it, and I'm not ashamed of it because it is power. Now notice, Paul does not say that the gospel of Jesus Christ brings power or it gives us power. What does he actually say? He says the gospel itself is the power of God. This is similar to the kinds of things that Jesus would say when he is on earth, when he meets people and he says things like this, I am the way. I am the truth. I am the life. In John's, one of his letters, John will write and say, God is love. Watch this carefully, not God is lovey, he's not lovey either. Okay, he's not lovely or he's not just loving. Of course, he is those things, but it actually says that God is the definition and the standard and the source of what love is. And in the same way the gospel doesn't bring power, the gospel is power. Because Jesus is the power in the gospel that changes people's lives, and Paul says saves them. The gospel is the power for salvation, meaning the power to rescue or deliver people into the very life of God for then everyone, anyone who believes. Christianity is often accused of being exclusive. Maybe you've heard that, or somebody has kind of made comments to you about, Christians are so narrow-minded, they're so focused on themselves, so exclusive. You have a one-way thing that you guys talk about. Well, perhaps sometimes Christians have acted exclusive and unwelcoming at times. For sure that's happened. But do you realize that the gospel is actually the most inclusive message ever? You know why it's the most inclusive message ever? It's inclusive because it does not demand from anyone a certain morality, a certain status, a certain ethnic background, a certain family name. It doesn't demand from you a spotless criminal record in order to be able to get in. You don't have to pass a background check in order to get into this thing. You don't have to make a financial contribution to get into the club. Do you know something I found out this week that's very interesting? Is that there are still golf clubs in the United States and other parts of the Western world that only admit men. They're still exclusive to men only. Women can't join those clubs. It's kind of crazy that in our day that kind of thing is still taking place. But here's the deal. If you are a woman, right, and you even could get in the club, you probably don't have enough money to get in that club, right? So you got to be a man and you got to have a lot of bank in order to be able to get in the club. That's exclusive. That's being exclusive. But not Christianity. Christianity has no such requirements or exclusions. There's only one requirement, and that one requirement is belief. And belief, not in yourself, and not in what you bring to the table, not in my record or my abilities, but belief in Jesus Christ, which means anyone can be saved. Anyone can be rescued into the life of God. Do you know, like every other religion makes you earn it somehow. Every other religion makes you work hard to get it, and here's the thing, you never really know if you're in. In every other religion, you gotta die and you gotta hope you did enough good things or you followed enough of the rules to be able to make it in with God. Not the gospel of Jesus. You believe in him, Paul says, and you are made right with God. It is inclusive. It is for everyone who believes. Paul goes on to say it this way, to the Jew first, or first to the Jew, and then to the Gentiles. Jews first, then Gentiles. I think two things Paul's getting at here. The first thing he's trying to say it's for everyone. And he uses just one of those common ways that people like to divide up the world. This is by ethnic, and maybe a little bit of religious background. Last week, he did these dichotomies, Greeks and non-Greeks, which we said was Greeks and barbarians, and then the wise and the foolish, and now another more common one, Jews and Gentiles. And so Paul is saying, hey, it's actually, however you divide the world up, whoever you do the us versus them thing, everybody, all people can come to God and have a relationship with him by faith in Jesus. But why does he say then Jews first to the Jews? Well, Paul probably here is, first of all, just making a logical historical statement. Jesus was a Jewish man born into a Jewish family, and the message originated in Jerusalem with Jesus and spread out from there. So logically and historically, it was Jews first, but always with the intention that it would come to the Gentiles, to all of the non-Jewish people. But I think there's also another reason why Paul brings this up, is because he's going to address this later, but in seed form here, he starts to tap into this issue that was probably going on in the Roman church, where there was a rivalry between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. The us versus them, the me versus you, because we always are trying to find somebody to look down upon, right? And there's lots of divides that we can come up with. Blue collar versus white collar, political divides, economic divides, even like a married single divide. Which one is better and which one is the more desired state that you're supposed to be in, right? Ethnic divisions. And so probably in the Roman church, what was going on is Gentile Christians were looking at their Jewish brothers and sisters and they were like, you Jews killed Jesus and you really screwed things up. You're still so stuck on the law. You people that are supposed to be first, you really messed all of this up and you're not as good as us. And the Jewish Christians are thinking that the Gentiles disrespect them and they disrespect the law. And the Jews are probably saying, you got to respect our first in the nation status. They're like Iowan Jews, right? You know, respect our first in the nation status when it comes to that. And so Paul makes it clear that the gospel is for everybody. Yes, it came to the Jews first, but now it has spread to the Gentiles. So folks, can we just get over ourselves and focus on the grace and the unity that Jesus Christ has brought to us all? And then he goes on to tell us what that beauty, that grace, that unity from God looks like. Verse 17, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. He says, the gospel reveals or brings to us the righteousness of God. Okay, sounds great. Gospel brings us the righteousness of God. Why do I need that? Why do you need the righteousness of God? Why would I want to care about and to have the righteousness of God? And that's what chapters 1 through 3 are actually all about, but let me take a short crack at it here. I imagine that you want to be right? Don't you want to be right? However you define rightness, whatever you really value, whatever rightness means to you in whatever arena, we all want that. And we want others to look at us that way, and we want others to respect us as being a right person. So for some of us, we really value our image and the way we look to other people on the outside, and so we value looking right, being right according to our image. I want to be seen as cool. I want to be seen as in. I want to be seen as fashionable, or at least fashion aware. Or on the other hand, some of you rebel against that, right? And you're like, my fashion is stuck in whatever decade I decided to jump off of the fashion train, and I want to be seen as frugal and astute and as being a person that doesn't care that much about fashion because I value other things. Either way, we all care about our image, and we want to be right in the image that we project to others. We want to have right opinions, right values, right affiliations. In fact, we don't want to have those things. We know we do have those things, and other people need to get on board with our values and opinions and positions on everything that we think about and everything that we value, right? I remember one time years ago, Michelle and I, we were living in Indiana, I think at the time, and we visited the Mall of America. And there was one store in the Mall of America I really wanted to go to because I grew up drinking sweet tea. My parents are originally from West Virginia. And then as we got a little bit older, my mom and I and others in the family, we would break out into like other forms of tea and types of tea. And this is years ago, the Mall of America had a Teavana store. Teavana was like this exclusive, high quality, loose leaf tea. We had one in Jordan Creek for a while before Starbucks bought them, and now they're all gone, right? But this was years ago up in Mall of America. And so we visit the store, and I was so excited to be there and check out, they had different samples that you could take, and it was very like, all the tea is in these special bins placed on a wall, and you can imagine how it's decorated, and it's all like everybody should be speaking with British accents in there or something like that, right? It's like high class. And so I asked the lady, I say to her, I'm thinking to myself, it's loose leaf tea, that's great, but tea in tea bags is a little bit easier, to be able to do on the daily. So I asked the lady, I said, hey, do you have any tea in tea bags? And she looked at me with the most condescending look I've ever had in my life, and she says, that would be like putting fine wine in a Dixie cup. It's like, so that's gonna be a no then, is what you have? I know what good tea is. I know how you should do tea, and this is the only way. Get on board with my view. I am right when it comes to tea. And look, we all have some measure of that. Things that we think, that we value, experiences we've been through, and this is the way. I am right on this thing. We want to be right morally. We want to be seen as a good moral person. We want to be right relationally. People seek me out, people want to have relationships with me. I have a high level of EQ. We want to be respected in our careers. In a discussion or argument that you have with somebody, how easy is it for you to acquiesce to others? How easy do you find yourself saying to somebody else, you know what, you are right. I was wrong, you are right, I need to admit that. I mean, even if you're nice about it, nobody likes to say I was wrong or admit it. What I'm telling you is there's just something inside of all of us where we want to be right, where we want to do right. And it's like we were made for this in the core of our being. And yet, can you ever fully grasp it? Do you ever really feel like you are right all the time in all of those ways? I think often we're striving for it, we're often even desperate for it, but doesn't it often elude us? Madonna, years ago, in an interview in Vogue magazine, said this, "My drive in life comes from a fear of being mediocre. That's always pushing me. I push past one spell of it and discover myself as a special human being. But then I feel I am still mediocre and uninteresting unless I do something else. Because even though I have become somebody, I still have to prove that I am somebody. Madonna is saying I still have to prove myself every single day, and even when I release a successful album and I have hundreds of thousands of people flocking after me, I wake up the next day and say I'm not enough. I haven't arrived. I haven't made it. I got to prove myself again. I'm not totally right. And sometimes I feel like it's there, but then it's gone. Don't you think this? In your mind and your heart sometimes say, am I good enough? Am I right enough? I think maybe we need a better way to be right. I think maybe we need the one who created us to bring rightness to us. And that's what happens in the gospel. That's what Paul is saying to us. In the gospel, the rightness, the righteousness of God is revealed to us. The way of rightness is provided for us. And when Paul uses this phrase, the righteousness of God, we got to talk about this a little bit. He could mean three different things by the righteousness of God. On one hand, when Paul says in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, he could be talking about God's character, right? And that might be the first most logical way you think about the righteousness of God. It's talking about the fact that God is righteous, that God is holy, that God is just, God's character. And of course, we know God is righteous, but I don't think that's the primary way Paul uses the term here. The second thing he could mean is this, God's activity. Like God is doing the right thing by providing salvation for people. Often in the Old Testament, God's righteousness and his salvation are linked together. Like in his rightness or in his justice, God delivers, God saves. And so it's more about like God's activity of saving humanity. He's right to save humanity and is proved to be righteous in doing that, God's activity. I don't think that's the primary way that Paul is using the righteousness of God here. It's the third way I think that Paul uses this, and it refers to God's achievement on our behalf. The righteousness of God is what God gives to his people, what God provides for his people. In other words, this could be translated the righteousness from God. Not so much the righteousness of God, though he is righteous. It is the righteousness that comes from God. A righteousness God gives to his people as a position, a right standing with him based on faith in Jesus Christ. Later in Romans, Paul is going to call this justification. The God himself is just, God is righteous, but he provides justification for us, a right legal standing, a positional standing of rightness with him. So later he'll say this, God is just, God is righteous, and he is the justifier of those who have faith in Jesus Christ. You see, the Bible describes our position without Jesus as this. They're words like lost, sinful, separated from God, in absolute trouble. But with Jesus, we gain the righteousness of God. We become right. And that's what Romans is all about. How everyone is lost. Every person in humanity is not righteous. How Jesus came as the righteousness of God to be able to grant us, reveal, and bring to us the righteousness of God through faith in him. And then as we trust in Jesus Christ, we become righteous, right? Before God, and all of these benefits are added on to us, the benefits Jesus brings us. So do you want to be a right person? Don't you want to be a right person? To be right with God, to know that no matter how people see you, no matter how people treat you in your daily life, no matter, get this, how you feel about yourself, no matter what you feel is true, there is a way that God sees you as right, and you can have the righteousness of God. If you want that, then verse 17. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from the first to the last, because it is written in the Old Testament prophet Habakkuk, the just will live by faith. God has revealed the opportunity for rightness to us, and he made it accessible to everyone through faith. That's the last part of Paul's big intro here in these first two verses, verse 16 and 17. It is received by faith. 3 times, right in verse 16 and 17. If you want to get like the emphasis of what Paul is getting at, you just look at what he keeps repeating. He says, it's for all who believe, it is by faith, it is by faith. Okay, so wait a minute. I can have the righteousness of God. Like God's righteousness, I can have that. I can be seen by God as being right. Yes, you can. But not because you have an education, and not because you live in America, and not even because you're a part of NorthPoint Church. I mean, we love this church. I love this place. I love you. But just being here doesn't make you right with God. I hope you know that. And actually, you can be right with God in spite of the fact that you maybe murdered someone. In spite of the fact that maybe you've been a scoundrel your entire life. Up to this point. Up to the point where you finally trust in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It is faith in him that brings you the righteousness of God from the first to the last. God is that powerful. It was this truth that from Romans that changed the Protestant reformer Martin Luther's life. And in large part, we are indebted to Martin Luther to be sitting here today as Protestants. Luther wasn't always there. He was a Catholic monk living in the 1500s, trying really hard to please God, trying really hard as a monk to be right with God. He devoted his life to serving God, and he was always at the same time wrestling with not being good enough until he finally understood Romans chapter 1 and verse 17. He describes it in his own words like this. Listen, he says, though I lived as a monk, I felt that I was a sinner before God with an extremely disturbed conscience. I didn't love, yes, I actually hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. And secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God. Can you believe this? You're like a monk, devoting your life to following God, and you actually hate him. And you feel tormented by him. And you feel like this whole thing is messed up and you can't be good enough. He says, I was angry with God, and I said, as if indeed it's not enough that miserable sinners, eternally lost through original sin, are crushed by every kind of calamity by the law of the Decalogue. Meaning all the laws in the Bible and the Old Testament law just crushes us because I can't ever perform and keep all of those things perfectly. And then God adds pain to pain by the gospel, and also by the gospel, threatening us with righteousness and wrath. He says, thus I raged with a fierce and troubled conscience. Nevertheless, he says, I beat importunately upon Paul at that place. Now, we don't use the word importunately very much, right, these days, so he just means I persevered. I was relentless in going to Paul in Romans 1:17 and trying to understand what he meant by the righteousness of God. He says, at last, by the mercy of God, meditating day and night, I gave heed to the context of the words, namely, in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed as it is written. And listen to how he translates the last part of verse 17. He who through faith is righteous shall live. He who through faith is righteous shall live. He says, there I began to understand that the righteousness of God is that by which the righteous lives by a gift of God, namely by faith. Here I felt that I was altogether born again and had entered paradise itself through open gates. So look, you do need to be made right with God. Your conscience tells you you need to be right. Your conscience tells you you need to be good and to do good, and you want to feel that within you. I need to be right with God. And the good news is there is a way. The one who through faith is righteous will live. That's the way. The one who through faith is righteous will live. So if you've been working for it, if you've been beat up by it, if you have struggled with your own humanity and just not able to be right and to feel right, turn to faith in Jesus Christ. He will make you right. He will give you the very righteousness of God through faith in him. That is the most amazing truth ever. And the rest of Romans opens all of that up to us. Verses 16 and 17 here are like the prologue. You know when you watch a Star Wars movie and at the beginning of the movie they have all that script on the screen that like slowly goes up into the galaxy and it says this is what the movie's going to be about. Count Dooku is on the move or whatever they say, right? And it's setting up the rest of the movie. That's 16 and 17 here set up the rest of the thing we're going to see as we dive into the depths, as we turn the diamond to see the righteousness, the beauty, and the goodness of God. Now, I got to tell you, there's some bad news first. Like next week, when you come back, we're going to go to verse 18. And what are the first few words of verse 18? The wrath of God. So we're about to talk about the wrath of God next week, and we're going to do that, and there's bad news. But here's what we say around here. Better to know the bad news than to act like it doesn't exist, right? If it's true, we got to deal with it. We want to talk about it and see what God has to say about it. And pretty soon what you're going to see, that bad news gives way to the greatness of the gospel, the righteousness of God given to us as a gift by faith in Jesus Christ. Now, I know that many of you who are here, you believe this. And there might be some other shades of understanding that you got to like, okay, that's a good perspective. Okay, I see that. That's good. That's good. But you believe this, and this is your hope. And so our challenge today actually lies at the beginning of verse 16, where it says, I'm not ashamed of this gospel. Let's talk about being unashamed of this gospel. Being ashamed is a feeling that results in action. And so being ashamed is always going to be a feeling or a sense that comes upon you or that you feel in your heart. But when the Bible talks about being ashamed, it always has in view like an action that feeling produces in you, right? And so you might imagine that, say I have a wound on my face, something is kind of messed up with my face, I might cover that up because I'm embarrassed by it. I don't want other people to see it. I'm self-conscious of it. I don't have confidence in it, so I cover it up. Or even decide I'm not leaving the house for a number of days because I don't want anybody else to see me, and I'm kind of ashamed of that, or I'm embarrassed about it, so I'm going to cover it up. Now, there's a lot of things that we might feel shame about. I might feel shame about my past, and so I don't bring it up. I don't want to open up. I don't trust anybody with it. I don't want to talk about it. I might be ashamed of my family or certain family members that I have, and so I don't bring it up. I don't talk about them. I don't share that with anybody. I might be ashamed that I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan. No, just kidding. Maybe not. Well, maybe. But so to be ashamed of the gospel would be to hide that I believe it. It would be to cover it up and hope I don't have to let that come out, right? It might be to shrink back from it. To hope people don't find out about it, or to never share it. Or sometimes when a door opens up, I'm just like, la, da, da, da. I didn't hear you. I don't think I need to say anything about that. Or not having to admit that I'm a follower of Jesus. Now, why might I be ashamed of the gospel? Because if Paul says here, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, that tells us that there is an option to be ashamed of it, right? Because he's saying the opposite of that. Why might you be ashamed of the gospel? Let me give a few quick reasons. One, the gospel is an admission that I'm not good enough, right? At the core of the gospel is going to be that I am not righteous, I am lost, I am not right with God, and I can't save myself. So at the core of, if I'm going to believe in Jesus, I'm going to believe that I need him, and we all like to be self-sufficient. And so the gospel admits that I'm not good enough. Secondly, the gospel is an admission that God works through suffering and weakness, and that is normally his way. In a world of status and climbing the ladder and success, we don't like the way of suffering or weakness. But when God himself becomes a human and allows the people that he created to murder him on a cross, that says God does things differently. And he accounts of power differently. Because the gospel is the power of God, but it's maybe not power in terms of status and success the way we think about it. And so believing in the gospel is embracing the way of God, which is often God working through, not success, the way we think of success. It's through weakness and suffering, and I might have to sometimes suffer. A third reason why I might be ashamed of the gospel is it opens me up to intellectual and social ridicule. Well, you know this. People might reject me. People might treat me differently. They might label me. They might discriminate against me. They might call me a bigot, or I'm exclusive, or I'm narrow-minded, or I'm on the wrong side of history, or whatever other terms could be thrown out there, but I might feel that pressure upon myself, right, if I claim that I'm a Christian. And some of you, especially this last one, you have dealt with at work. You've dealt with, some of you, within your own family. Some of you deal with that with neighbors and in the environment that you're in. I imagine if you're a teenager that's here today, you deal with this at school sometimes. That sense of like, just shrink back. Just don't claim that you're a Christian. Just don't live out your Christianity and you're following Jesus. And you have a pressure to hide your faith in Jesus because if you say something, even in a gracious way, it might cost you. It might cost you socially. It might cost you friendships. It might cost you in a number of ways, right? To not live for him because of the cost. So How do we overcome that? Well, what does it look like for us, recognizing that there is a cost and these things are at stake here? What does it look like to live unashamed of the gospel? I am a follower of Jesus. To be able to speak up when God calls us to speak up, to be able to articulate our faith and share the gospel with people. What does that look like? Well, I think when we talk about what it looks like to live unashamed of the gospel, it helps a little bit to say what it's not. And the first thing that living unashamed of the gospel is not is it doesn't mean that you have no fear. It doesn't mean that you're just boldly courageous every second of the day and you completely feel it all the time. No. Living unashamed of the gospel doesn't mean you have no fear or that you have no doubts. The Apostle Paul, who's writing this letter, when he went to one of these cities on his missionary journeys, the city of Corinth, you know what he says to the people in Corinth? I came to you in Corinth in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. The great Apostle Paul came to a city, and this is how he described it: weakness, fear, and trembling. Being unashamed of the gospel doesn't mean you have no fears. It doesn't mean you don't feel weak. It doesn't mean that you don't sometimes struggle. And that should encourage us. That being unashamed of Jesus doesn't mean I have no doubts, that I have no fears. The second thing it doesn't mean that you must defend all Christian actions everywhere for all time, including your own. Meaning, there are things sometimes that Christians have said or done, or that Christianity has been known for, that are not good, right? Like the Crusades and defending slavery and being for Jim Crow laws. Today, there are sometimes things that Christian leaders say, and Christianity gets a brand according to those leaders, and you're like, I am embarrassed about that. And you know what? There's some things you're like, that I don't know. I don't think that's right. And so what do we do with those things where there's things that Christians say and are known for and are do that we are embarrassed about? We just say, that's wrong. We admit it. If we're part of it, we repent of that. And we admit that that was wrong, right? Now, I would say this, there are a lot of things that Christians have done throughout history that they don't get credit for. Like almost every single medical institution that we have today was founded by Christians, churches, and Christian organizations seeking to care for the poor and the needy. So that is absolutely true, but there also are some black eyes. And the same thing is true for your own life. You're not perfect. You know that, right? This is one of those, I love you, but you're not perfect. You know, I'm not either. We say things sometimes. We mess up. We do things in a wrong way. You don't have to be unashamed and defensive of any of that. Do you know Paul was embarrassed about his past? Paul was, to use the Bible word, he was ashamed of his past. He actually calls it a word that I can't say out loud to you if I translate it into the real English word, but it is the word for dung. That's what he calls his past. It's rubbish. It's dung. That's what it is. It's okay to be honest and humble about ourselves and even our failures, but the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's where our confidence lies, who Jesus is, what Jesus has done. There's no shame in him. There's no shrinking back from him. Thirdly, living unashamed of the gospel doesn't mean that you must give everyone a piece of your mind, right? Now, some of you aren't inclined to this, but others of you are. You're truth warriors. You're black and white, this is the way it is, I gotta get the truth out there. And so you think, all right, I'm gonna be bold, I'm gonna let people know who Jesus is, I'm gonna stand up for my rights. Whenever I hear says Christians be like, I'm gonna stand up for my rights, I always cringe a little bit because I'm like, I don't know if we've trusted Jesus, we have any rights. I think when we say I want to stand up for Jesus and who he is as he calls me to do that in his way, which is always grace with truth, right? But when I'm talking about my rights and standing up, I don't know. I just get very uncomfortable with that because I don't think that's what it means to live unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Sometimes when I do that and I give everybody a piece of my mind, it's a piece of my mind that I can't afford to lose, to give them, but also it's about my opinion. Or something that I'm passionate about. And we always say this around here. You have opinions, and you can't get away from having opinions. And you can have opinions and affiliations. That's totally fine. We're humans. We can't get away from it. But what are we most passionate about? What am I unashamed of? There's one thing here. It's Jesus. And it is the gospel, rightly understood as the power of God, that I'm unashamed of. We had one of our daughters, when she was little, I'm not going to say which one it was, but like when she was in preschool, she came home from preschool and she would do an assessment, of every person in her class and where they were at with God. you know? And so she came home and she's like, okay, I think Billy goes to church. Okay, I think Jenna does go to church. I think Tommy, like he doesn't go to church. And I asked my teacher and she didn't want to talk about it. So I don't think she's in. You know, and so she would have these conversations with us, which I love that she cared about people's like relationship with God. That was absolutely amazing. But over time, we also had to make sure that she didn't correct everybody all the time and tell them exactly what to do, because she also told her preschool class that Santa Claus doesn't exist. You know, so did you do that when you were little? And so we got a talking to from the preschool director about could this daughter, I almost said her name, could she not ruin Christmas for the rest of the preschool, you know, students? So. But she liked to know, and she wanted to go with it, right? And so what I'm saying is I love that. And if God has created you that way and he has put that sense of truth inside of you, hold that truth with the grace of Jesus and make sure the truth that you hold to is the truth of the gospel. Have your opinions, but those got to be off to the side. It's got to be about Jesus and the gospel. That's what we're unashamed about. So what does it mean to be unashamed? One thing, and it's going to be a little surprising. What it means to be unashamed is meaning I choose to trust God. Being unashamed means I choose to trust God. Now, you might think that being unashamed means that I'm bold, right? That I'm not embarrassed, and so I'm bold, and so I get after it, and I tell people I'm a follower of Jesus, and I don't compromise, and I let them know that I'm a follower of Jesus, whatever that costs me. Well, it gets to that, but that's not exactly the opposite of being ashamed. The opposite of being ashamed is trusting God. Look at how he says it in verse 16. And I'm going to put some words in here to see what Paul says. I am not ashamed of the gospel because I believe at the core of my being, the gospel is the power of God. The gospel is what brings salvation. That's what I believe. The gospel brings salvation to everyone who believes in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then two more times in verse 17, all of this is by faith. It is by faith. It is by trusting not in my ability to be courageous and to be bold with my faith, but my trust and my faith in Jesus Christ. Because see, here's what I think the mistake we could make. I could say to myself, Jeremy, you're being a coward. You're not standing up for your faith. You're not willing to count the cost. So Jeremy, be bold, be bold, be bold. Be ready to speak. Be ready to get after it. You need to do this. And when I do that, it's all about me. And it's about my power, and it's about my courage and my boldness, instead of, Jeremy, you're kind of shrinking back from that, and you're kind of cowering from that a little bit. Jesus, help me to believe you. Help me to trust you. Help me to see what you say is true. Help me to know what you want me to say. That's trust in Jesus Christ. My eyes are fixed on him. And then with his power and with his strength, I can speak up, or I can be quiet when he tells me to. Right? I know what that looks like and how I can approach all of those situations. The reason I say this is I don't want you to leave this place today being like, I got to be unashamed of the gospel. Be bold, be bold, be bold. You don't want to be ashamed of Jesus, do you, loser? Right? Like you're saying that in your mind. Don't be a loser and be ashamed of Jesus. Jesus doesn't want you to think that way. He wants you to look to him. He wants you to rest in him. He wants you to trust in him. He wants you to look at Romans chapter 1 and say, I belong to God, the God of the universe. And there might not be anybody else in my immediate environment here that believes that or hopes in that, but I have a confidence in Jesus Christ, and he's got me, and he is good, and he is worth it. I'm obligated to that. I'm eager to share that. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ because he's not ashamed of me. So when the opportunity comes, or the pressure is on you this week, maybe even when some fear creeps into your heart and you're tempted to shrink back, don't say, be bold, be bold, be bold. Say, God, you got me. Father, you love me. Jesus, you've given me the righteousness of God. You know he's with you. You know he's guiding you, and you know he is worth it. I think God's going to open some doors this week. Be like, Jeremy, I wish you wouldn't have spoken on this, because he is. You're going to have opportunities this week, and he's going to open doors for you. And in that moment, look to him. Turn to him. Some of you right now, maybe even as we're talking, you're thinking about some things that have already happened the last couple weeks or the last month, or a relationship or a situation that you're in. And God wants to give you guidance right now and say, I want to help you be unashamed by looking to me. And I want to show you what that looks like. So one more time, I'll encourage you. Don't be bold, be bold, be bold. Trust in Jesus. Trust in the goodness and the grace of God. He has you and he is good. So with eyes fixed on him, let's be unashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Would you pray with me?